All right, so good evening. Welcome to tonight's class on fundamental wisdom. Let's go ahead and begin as we've been doing on page 73 with the praise to Shakyamuni Buddha that we'll do 3 times in English. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. Now go forward to page 97 or 98, depending on which version of the prayer book. And those of you who might be online using an older version of the prayer book, it's page 88, I believe, that you'll find those prayers on. We're going to do the short mandala offering in English, and then the offering mantra that follows from that, that's on 98, and then on the bottom of 98 or 88, again, if you have the older book, is Refuge in Bodhicitta, which we'll do once in English, twice in the Tibetan. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandala Kam Niryata Yami. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki chognam la chang chu bardu dakni kyab suchi daki chanyan gi peso nam gi jola penshir sangye drupar shog sangye chodang soki chognam la chang chu bardu dakni kyab suchi Daki Chanyangi Pesonamgi Jola Penshir Sangye Druparsho. You can set the prayer books aside till the end of class when we do dedication. Let's go ahead and do a short meditation. Give ourselves a chance to focus the mind a bit, to let go of whatever distractions we might have. And then on the basis of a bit calmer, focused mind, we'll generate a good motivation for being here tonight. So again, most of you have a technique that you might already use with the breath. You can do that. If not, I generally suggest tuning into that sensation that occurs in the area of the nostrils, just inside the nose where you feel the air coming in when you breathe in and the air going back out when you exhale. Make that your meditation object. In any of our meditations on the breath, we want to have that factor of introspection, checking in occasionally to see the quality of our meditation. And if we check in and see that we've lost the meditation object, that we've wandered away, gotten caught up in thoughts or distractions of whatever variety, when that's happened, we let go of whatever it was that distracted us, that pulled us away. and then gently return to the breath. So I'll ring the chime. We'll do this in silence for just a few minutes, and then I'll lead you in a short reflection to set your motivation. So now with our minds a bit more focused, let's generate the motivation of bodhicitta. And to do this tonight, sometimes it's very useful to go back to that concept of Buddha nature that is so central to what we're doing in this course, as well as to the whole path to enlightenment that bodhicitta is aimed at. Buddha nature is essentially referring to the fact that our minds are empty of inherent existence, because the states of mind that arise, that we call the afflictions, arise due to their causes and conditions. This is because the mind lacks inherent existence. All the stains in the mind, everything that obscures the mind, is only there adventitiously. It's not inherent to the mind to have anger, to have attachment, jealousy, pride, and so on. And the root of all of these, ignorance, can most definitely be removed when we create the opposing causes, when we create the antidote, the ultimate antidote. So Buddha nature at its most fundamental level is pointing to the emptiness of the mind lacking inherent existence. It therefore can be changed. And that refers then to the developmental aspect of Buddha nature, that every time we turn our minds toward the Dharma, we create the causes continually to eventually achieve that result, the complete purification of the mind. So when we generate bodhicitta, we do so with that knowledge that each of us possesses Buddha nature, that each of us has a fundamentally pure mind, and all these adventitious stains can be removed. So knowing that that can happen for ourselves, we have complete confidence in the one aspect of bodhicitta, that we can become a Buddha. And we do it for the sake of others because we also understand that they have Buddha nature. Every single being that is the object of this mind of bodhicitta can attain enlightenment because they have that fundamentally pure mind. So when we dedicate ourselves to achieving enlightenment for the sake of others, it's all within the understanding that all beings have that potential, can develop their minds to that degree. And we want to become a part of the causes and conditions that will help all beings to do that. So try to hold that mind of bodhicitta very firmly, informed by Buddha nature, informed by what we are trying to accomplish here, planting the seeds for the enlightenment of all beings. Okay, so we are making our way through chapter 18. Again, we started with chapter 26, going through the order that His Holiness the Dalai Lama uses when he teaches this. One of the main texts I've been using, of course, to reference here and there is the transcripts of when His Holiness taught this in 2004 in Toronto. And I probably have a few citations from that tonight. But then we've been also using Lama Tsongkhapa's Ocean of Reasoning. There's an extra copy that I found upstairs. If anyone wants to refer to that, I'll be going through some of the pages of that. This was the copy, I think I had that one and then found a hard copy edition of it, which is much nicer, holds up a little better. But yeah, it might be good to follow those of you who would like to follow with the teachings there. So we've really only essentially gone through the first verse. We haven't really done much more of chapter 18, which is okay because we had to spend a lot of time on that verse. The rest of the verses in the chapter won't be quite as long. Let's read the first verse of chapter 18 together right now. If self were the aggregates, it would have a rising and disintegration. If it were different from the aggregates, it would not have the characteristics of the aggregates. So this is looking at, again, these two fundamental parts of what is often called the four-point analysis. Remember, I went through this previously. I'll just go through it very briefly. We start off with identifying the object of negation, making sure we're very clear about this sense of an inherently existent I that we are trying to refute. Again, since beginningless time, we've had ignorance that has held to that inherently existent I as if it were real. And that reality is not, there's not an atom of reality to the I or to any phenomena. This chapter in particular is focusing on the I, the self, the person, and trying to refute the inherent existence of that person. Because this is what's driving the show. We alluded to this as the view of the transitory collection. It's the aggregates are involved, but it's essentially the I that is imputed on the aggregates that is being held to inherently exist. Because that's the only way that the I exists, is by merely being imputed on the aggregates. But there's also another aspect to the view of the transitory collection, which is called the view of the mine, M-I-N-E, mine or my. It's when the I becomes a possessor. And there's not only this adherence to I, but there's also the my that has my objects of use in the world around me and objects of enjoyment, as well as my body, all the parts of my body, all the clinging to all of this. So it's not actually referring to those phenomena. It's referring to the person who is the owner of that. We'll get into that with verse 2 when we look at this idea of mind being refuted as well. But it's sort of another dimension that obviously is quite instrumental in how the delusions arise, right? Because we don't get caught up in things until we start thinking of them as mine and try to distinguish them as what different from what others possess. And if others try to possess what we have or mess with what we have, then we have all these problems that arise. So that's the very first point to this fourfold analysis, is that we have to get real clear about the object of that view of the transitory collection, the way that we are holding the I to exist, as if it was real. Again, this is Lama Zopa Rinpoche's words. He always uses the real I. But that's because that infuses all of our thinking in general. How we go about living our lives is thinking there's a real person here, a real I that we are clinging to. Now, by that reality, thinking of it in that way is inherently existent. It means that it should be findable. There should be something that we should be able to locate as the referent of that thought of I. Again, there is still an I that exists, but the I that exists is very, very subtle, as I just pointed out. It's merely imputed. It's only got nominal existence. Whereas this seems like objective existence, something that is more substantial, existing from its own side, existing by way of its own characteristics, self-existent, substantially existent. All these terms are interchangeable for this false concept that we have about the I. So the implication of that type of a view of the I is that we should be able to find something that is it. If it is real, you should be able to locate it. So this process, the remaining 3 steps, are to determine, first of all, in the second step, what are the possibilities for finding that I? Either that I, if it's real and there's a real referent of it, we can find something that is it, is going to be something among, the same as the aggregates or some portion of the aggregates, the mind and body, and so on. Or it's going to be completely different. Same or different. This is a dichotomy. You can't have anything more than those 2 possibilities. Either something is the same as it or it's different from it. Is there a third possibility? No, because those are the 2 options that you have. If you can find a third possibility, I welcome it. But if it exists, it has to be either the same as or different from something. So we are looking essentially as it being the same as this collection of body and mind or some aspect of it, or completely different from, completely separate from that, something else. That's the second step, is to determine those 2 possibilities, to get very clear in your mind that they are the only 2 possibilities. Then you go looking in the third step for what it says here: if the self were the aggregates, then what would be the consequences of that? If the self was equivalent, this inherently existent I was equivalent to the mind and body, the mind-body complex, or just the mind, or just the body, or whatever the case might be, what would be the consequences of that? Here we're looking at it as if it were, equivalent to all of the aggregates, that if there were these, again, Buddha defined 5 aggregates, the first one being form, which is our body, the remaining 4 being part of our mind, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, and consciousness. So those 4 kind of can be lumped as mind, and the first one body. So we go looking for this real I to be, in this third step, equivalent to, the same as, the mind-body complex. Or again, you could even do the analysis to see if it's one part of that. But that kind of belies our experience, because we do have this feeling of a unitary I that encompasses all of this. But the consequence there is, that's being spelled out, is it would have a rising and disintegration, meaning that when these aggregates come into existence, the mind-body of this life, which began when you were conceived, you would then have the self arising in a inherently existent way. And it would continue until the end of this life, and the self would completely disappear. But this isn't, of course, how the Buddha teaches things. There is a self that is imputed on the basis of a continuity of mind that goes from life to life. Your self doesn't completely come into existence in this life and utterly go out of existence at the end of this life. There's not a, because there'd be these other consequences that you would then have, by virtue of all of that happening, you would have a disconnect in terms of how things are occurring karmically and what have you. But essentially this arising and disintegration that occurs in a very gross way at the beginning and end of this life would be happening to the self. There's also the consequence that if there's a unitary self that we're looking for, this inherently existent I that has this unitary quality, then there must be only one aggregate, because we have to find one thing that is it, that is equivalent to it. Or there must be 5 I's because there are 5 aggregates, or even 2 because we say mind and body. Well, there's the I that is your mind and the I that is your body. Do you feel like there are 2 I's here? Not 2 I's here, but 2 I's here. Do you feel that there are 2 persons here? The I that is my body. Oh, the I that is my body is going to go to sleep while the I that is my mind is going to meditate. Do we have that option? Doesn't seem like it, right? So again, we don't have these experiences. This is why, again, we're working with this school that's called the Prasangika, the consequence school, because they look at the consequences of holding to this inherently existent I. You can also, as I said, go looking for it, do the little investigation, say, okay, well, then where is it? If it is the totality of my body-mind complex, well, you've got, once more, 2 things there. Well, you can't find it to be just, both of them, because they're disparate substances. The mind is not material. The body is completely material. So you have these impossibilities when you go looking in this way. But if you say that it's completely equivalent to the mind, well, that excludes any type of body experience being the I, which we know isn't true. As I keep pointing out, we even identify people on the basis of their bodies. We don't say, oh, there's Judith's mind. It's like, oh, there's Judith because we see Judith's body, right? Judith's mind is here today. So again, we don't have this ability to locate something within this mind-body complex that is the exact equivalent to what this sense of I is. That is what we are searching for as this real, inherently existent I. The 4th step is to look in the other possibility. Well, what if it was completely different, completely separate? That's the next 2 lines. If it were different from the aggregates, meaning inherently different, because it is different. The self and the aggregates are 2 distinct phenomena. One is the label and the other is the basis of labeling or designation. So in that way, we can say they're different, but they're only conventionally different. They're not ultimately different. So the idea is that if they were utterly inherently different, so that you would have absolutely no relationship between what we call the self and what we call the aggregates, well then it wouldn't have the characteristics of the aggregates. So any of the aggregates, like the aggregate of feeling, you would never be able to say, I'm experiencing happiness. Why? Because the self doesn't have the characteristics of feeling, because feeling is completely distinct from the self. So the 5 aggregates are having their own little experience while the self is having some other experience. We know that that's not the case, right? What the aggregates experience, we experience. When the body is injured, we say, I'm hurt. We don't say, oh, well, we might say my body is hurt. Some people might say that, but they don't have the feeling that it's something that they're not even experiencing, right? Oh, I'm over here and I'm watching my body being hurt. It's over there. Go take care of that body, it's hurt. As if I'm not hurt at all. So again, we see that there are many consequences if it were completely distinct. But once more, you can even do the visualization. Take the mind-body complex, all the aggregates off your cushion, off your chair. Is the self remaining there? Is there something that we would identify as the self that's still on the cushion when the mind and body have been removed? No. I mean, you don't see some kind of leftover bit that's called the self that's still sitting there after your aggregates have gotten off the cushion, right? So this is what we've been talking about, is kind of refuting the self in this way, this inherently existent self, through this 4-point analysis. And of course, Tsongkhapa doesn't go into all the details of that, but on page 374, let me just go through this last little bit that kind of wraps this up, and then we'll see if there are any questions before we continue with new material. Tsongkhapa says here, I'm going to skip this first line of the last paragraph in the middle of the page there. He says, so if the self existed inherently, the self and the aggregates would have to be either identical or different through their own characteristics. Again, we're talking about inherently different or inherently the same, not just, conventionally. Because once more, we might say that the self is the same as the aggregates to some degree, different to some degree, but that's just in conventional language. When we get down to the ultimate analysis, is there something that really is the self, that is identical to the aggregates or that is completely different from the aggregates? When both of these positions are seen to have been undermined by arguments, one develops complete certainty that the self cannot exist inherently, even the slightest bit. This is to develop an understanding of the view according to which the object of self self-grasping through the innate view of the transitory aggregates or transitory collection is essenceless. In other words, the object that we have been clinging to with this view, because again, the aggregates are appearing, we have a self that's imputed on that, and we think that's a real self. We think there's something that is real about that. That object that we are holding to is fictitious. It's a complete lie. It's not grounded in reality. If we go through this analysis and we refute that it could be the same as, identical to the aggregates, or different from the aggregates, and it's neither of those, well, then we refuted it, because the second step said those are the only two possibilities, right? So let me see if there are any questions on this before we go on to the new material. Okay.
People often think like a light particle is also a light wave. The self can be both, same and different from the aggregates. What do you think?
So Rachel's question is, yeah, if you didn't hear it, that in the way that we say that light waves are a particle or a wave, and quantum physics, I guess this is a way that they've kind of discerned this, that some people might say that the self could be both the same or different. Same and different. But I mean, this gets to be kind of a problem in terms of, again, maybe with wave and particle, you might not have a problem, I'm not sure, because I guess it, again, depends upon how you are looking at that appearance. But with regard to same or different, I think it does get to be a dichotomy. If you have something that is both the same as and different from, it doesn't seem that logically that could actually exist. I don't want to debate quantum physics because I don't know quantum physics well enough. Maybe Bob could stand in for me. but if we say that something is both the same and different, how I mean, can we point to anything in our experience that is both in the world?
What about desire?
What is your, that's just one word. What do you mean, Mark?
Okay.
What is?
No problem with self as a persistent object. It doesn't exist.
Okay.
But when I search for the self, what I find is desire and judgment. That's when those arise, that is the arising of self.
So I guess.
So I'm whatever I'm nowhere, and then desire arises. Okay, and that's suddenly I go, uh-oh, I exist and I want it, and my vision becomes distracted.
Right. So Mark is talking about when desire or judgment arises that he has that, then that's when the self is arising for you. But again, this is more the process of it. I guess what you have to do, I mean, we'll get back to the same and different question in a moment, but what you have to do is when we say that the self is arising at that time, not go looking for the strong sense of self that is driving all of that is driving the desire. The desire is a manifestation of that self. It's an affliction that arises on the basis of that holding to an inherently existent self. So it's a good clue, certainly, because yeah, anytime any of the afflictions are present, anytime anger is present, anytime desire, jealousy, pride, judgment, whatever, all these various states of mind that are negative, whenever they are present, then the inherently existent I is being conceived, because it is the groundwork, the root of all of the other delusions. So, but the point is, at that point, I'm not sure what you're getting at with the common necessarily, but same or
different.
But it's same and different. Was
so I'm saying, for me, it's different in that it's those afflictions.
But I guess I'm having a hard time saying, I mean, so the afflictions are the same as the I and different from the I? Is that what you're saying? I'm not sure.
I can't find the I, except I can find the afflictions.
You can't find the I, but you could find the afflictions. But again, even the afflictions lack inherent existence. But we're not talking about analyzing the afflictions yet. We're talking about analyzing the I. That is the strong sense of I that is driving the afflictions. But I mean, obviously, when we kind of go into a free association with various things around the I, we can find lots of things that are kind of part of this I, because once more, we have 5 aggregates. The afflictions are all included in the 4th aggregate, the compositional factors, which includes all the other states of mind that we have, besides feeling and discrimination. Those 2 mental factors are isolated because the Buddha felt they were really relevant to our experience. They're called mental factors, and in this 4th aggregate, they're called compositional factors. They're kind of lumped into that. They are aspects of mind that are more functional in nature. So all of your delusions are part of the basis for an I. All of your virtuous minds are part of the basis for an I. All of your thoughts are part of the basis for the I. Everything in your mental horizon is part of the basis for an I. But as we do in this analysis, we don't find it to be equivalent to any of those thoughts or the sum of those thoughts in terms of mind. So we never find any of those things to be the same as the I in an ultimate way. So I don't think I mean, again, I don't think that in our experience in the world, we ever see something that is the same as something else and completely different from something else. I mean, you might look at something and say it has similar characteristics. Like if we talk about a sprout coming from a,
Like, you know, what do you call extra solar planets?
Mhm.
You know, mostly we don't see those at all. We just look at other planets and they have kind of weird wobbles. And we go, oh, other stars that have a weird wobble. So we go, oh, there's a planet. Well, we can't see them. Just infer from the wobble,
Right.
the weird wobble. But so, that is.
I'm not sure where that's going either. I'm sorry, Mark.
Well, I can't, yeah, you're right. I'm just inferring that self exists from its weird effects.
I mean, we do have some things. I was going to point out this idea of like, because this is one of the ways that they analyze production from self or from other, whether something is produced from something that is the same as itself or completely different. And they mean in an inherent way. But if they look at like a sprout that arises from a seed, well, obviously it has some of the characteristics of the seed because it's the seed is genetically, capable of producing a particular type of sprout, right? And so there's something that it's the continuity of the seed into the sprout that is obviously something that is the same in a conventional way, but not ultimately the same, or else there wouldn't need to be any changing because it would already be identical to its cause. The effect and the cause would be identical. But it can't be completely different, though it might be nominally different. We call it a sprout versus a seed. But there's something that you can't make them utterly different because then there would be no relationship at all. You wouldn't see the seed arising into the sprout. So we do see some things that on a conventional level seem to have some sameness and some difference, but you never see them ultimately to be the same and different. Because that would, again, belie all of what we're looking for. We're looking for something that either is inherently the same or inherently different. So we're not just talking about conventional. That's the one thing about Rachel's question too, is that we're not just talking about it in a conventional way, because we do see some things that might have some similarity and yet some difference. That can be, nominally existent in that way, but ultimately we can't find it, I don't think. Yeah, Bob.
Yeah, actually that's pulled up because it's not saying an electron, the particle is a wave or wave is a particle. It's just one object that behaves different ways in different circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
But what we're inherently saying, it would always have to be either a wave or a particle. It couldn't exhibit different behaviors under
Right.
different circumstances.
Right.
It's just a single object
Right.
that has complicated properties.
Yeah. So Bob, I won't repeat all of what Bob said, but Bob said that, yeah, I mean, it comes down to the appearance to that particular, depending upon the conditions of what you're looking at. If they were inherently a wave or inherently a particle, you would never be able to see it in another way. So again, in a conventional basis, there's no problem for what quantum physics is finding in terms of having the appearance of a particle at times behaving as a particle and behaving as a wave, because it really depends upon the observer and the conditions. But nonetheless, when we get to this type of analysis, we're looking at ultimately the same or ultimately different. We cannot find something that is both. because ultimately would completely belie that, because it either has to ultimately be the same and then it could never be different. There'd be no room for it to be different because it's ultimately the same. And if it was ultimately different, there would be no room for it to be the same. You see what I'm saying? But this is a bit of the challenge of doing these types of analyses, is we have to put on that little hat of the assumptions that are being made around what inherent existence really means. Now, do we actually go through a process of that when we decide to agree to that, when we induce that thought of an inherently existent I? No, we just do it habitually. We don't sit there and go, oh, I'm observing the mere I that is imputed on my aggregate. Should I see it as inherently existent or shouldn't I? Unless you're trained in all the philosophy that we're going through, the Madhyamika philosophy, you don't go through any of that. You just immediately grab onto the I, because you're habituated to do that. So we're looking at the consequences of if that I existed in the way that you think it does, when that ignorance is present, it would have to be inherently the same or inherently different. That I, if it's inherently existent, has to exist in one of those two ways. There can't be both. Any other comments or questions? Shall we move on? Okay, let's go on then to the next two lines, the first two of verse 2. This is again refuting that idea of mine. If the self itself does not exist, how can there be mine? So once more, the view of the transitory collection has those two things that are being observed. The mere I and the mere mind that it thinks is a real I and a real mine. A real sense of the owner, the myness of, the various things that the self possesses. So let me read a little of what Tsongkhapa says. He has a very short section for this. He says, when we analyze being mine, which is how J. Garfield puts it in here, which is the object grasped by the thought, this is mine, through the innate view of the transitory aggregates, inquiring whether or not it exists through its own characteristic, in other words, whether it exists inherently, truly, in reality, wondering how, since the self does not exist inherently, being mine could exist inherently, then being mine is understood to be essenceless. Because it's the same type of analysis. We're looking at the same kind of idea, because the sense of my or mine is arising in conjunction with the sense of I. It's not, it is a separate thought, because once more, it's when that I gets into the mode of possessing, of having things, having again our objects of enjoyment in the world at large, but also the aggregates that we possess, my mind and my body. But it's not the actual body and mind that are possessed, it's the myness that happens to them. There's a little bit of a debate on this as to whether, and if you've got Emptiness Yoga by Jeffrey Hopkins, there's a little passage in here where Jamyang Shepa goes into this, and he talks about there's kind of two different kind of parties to this. One that will say it is the objects that are owned, but in the sense that these various things, they don't have, if they would be a self of phenomena that we're talking about if we're just talking about them there. But once I say my mug, my thermal mug, then it becomes, by virtue of that possessor, it becomes mine. But they still have it more of the objective things, but once they are owned by a person. Whereas, as I was explaining, the one that Jamyang Shepa and Tsongkhapa seems to agree with is when the my is just the sense of the owner, the sense of the possessor that we have in relation to all these things. So this is what he says, one system, eyes, ears, and so forth are the basis of designation of the mind, but are not illustrations of mind, because it is not feasible for a basis of designation to be the phenomenon designated. Maybe it's getting a little confusing by adding some of this in. Let me read what he says earlier. Two different ways of asserting mind appear. One system explains that the eyes, ears, and so forth included in one's own continuum are illustrations of mind, but are not objects of observation of an innate false view of the transitory collection that conceives inherently existent mind. They explain that this is the thought of the foremost Father Tsongkhapa and his spiritual sons. So again, we can say that these appear and are part of the grasping at the sense of mind. But in order for it to be a view of the transitory collection, it has to be a view of a person, and the I in particular. Because this is what's driving the show. When we went through chapter 26, remember we started off with ignorance, the very first link. And ignorance is equivalent to this view of the transitory collection. It is the grasping at the I, that is the person, self that we hold to, and then the sense of mind that occurs on the basis of that I, when again becomes the owner of all these various objects, particularly those things in one's own continuum and so on. So anyway, the idea here is that this is the sense that we want to be talking about here, is that it is this I that is the owner. So Tsongkhapa goes on to say in Ocean of Reasoning, again on page 374, he says, the cognitive process itself that understands the essencelessness of what is called I does not grasp the essencelessness of being mine. Because again, this is a separate thought. This is another thought of that I becoming a possessor, an owner. So it's not to say that when we are realizing the emptiness of I, we are realizing the emptiness of mind, but it's a very easy translation from one to the other. He goes on to say, but when the mind analyzes whether or not being mine exists essentially and turns its attention to its previous understanding when it analyzed I, then depending on that previous cognitive process without needing any further proof, this understanding of the essencelessness of being mine develops. You know, and this is what they actually say is once you realize emptiness correctly in regard to any phenomenon, you can pretty much translate the same analysis and same understanding to everything else that exists. Because everything lacks essence in the same way. Yeah, Bob.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of obvious that, objects.
Yeah.
If there's no possessor, how can it be possessed?
How can you have the
Yeah.
Well,
and in a certain sense, the sense of mind or possession
Mhm.
is sort of an ephemeral thing, or sort of, it's just a pure conception because, maybe I can say I own this book. What does that mean? There's no
Yeah.
mark of the book that indicates mine. I mean, it's just an
Yeah.
idea that I own it.
Right.
Maybe somebody takes it and steals it, and then they would say, well, it's theirs. But it's just,
Yeah.
Ownership is sort of such a
But yeah, and that's why they are often going back to the aggregates, because that is probably what we have the strongest sense of a mind with. Bob was just talking about with physical objects. Well, then of course, it's the mindness is really just obviously an imputation because anyone could come up here and take all these books away from me and then they're theirs, they're no longer mine. But when we talk about my feelings, for example, in the aggregates, well, then this is where we get caught up in a lot of our stuff, right? Because there is that I that is the experiencer of those feelings and holds on to those feelings as mine. And then on the basis of that makes decisions about how to act in the world in accord with that are driven by delusion. So we see it more in regard to, again, the body that we own, the feelings that we own, the so on, all of these aggregates that we're so tightly caught up in. But it does manifest as the I that possesses all the physical things in the world as well. But
It almost seems though, like you say, my body.
Mhm.
It really seems more like part of me than you could call it my body. It's,
yeah.
it's sort of again the idea that I'm possessing my body.
But again,
the only
yeah.
way you can make sense of I'm possessing my body is to imagine that the sun, that is me, is really separate from my body.
Mhm.
And possesses it.
But again, we get so many of these different concepts caught up. Bob was just saying that that body seems more like a part of me than it is possessed by me. But I think it kind of floats back and forth, because we'll have times where we go, oh, my body's a mess today, and it feels like something really quite distinct. Now, at those times, is it more of that other version of the false I that we were talking about last week, which is the coarser than this one, but still something that needs to be refuted, which is that sense of a self-sufficient I that can stand on its own among the aggregates, kind of there with them saying, my body, my mind, you do this, you do that, kind of the master, the one in charge. So it could be a floating in between, back and forth between those. But when, once more, this sense of the real I is something that we can find absolutely, that is like substantially there. It has its own essence, its own thing, its own existing from its own side. So whether it's the body or the mind, the collection of this, I think most people think it's just the totality of it. And that's what we tend to hold to quite a bit. So yeah, the body does seem to be a part of that in some regard because we think there is an I that covers this whole thing, that is on top of this whole experience in a substantial way. But it's just labeled, merely labeled. Yeah, Bob.
Yeah, maybe the real problem is that our notion of what an I really is confused. Our mind
Yeah.
back and forth.
Yeah. So Bob's saying, yeah, that part of it could be that the I is just a product of all these various views. Absolutely. I mean, this is again where we're really trying to, undermine these views. That's why just going right to Prasangika Madhyamaka, which text is meant to explain, is really good, but it jumps over any other false views that we might have that could be commingling with that, could be influencing us at other times. So Tsongkhapa continues. Let me just finish this section. He says, therefore, in the treatises, this is top of page 375, therefore, in the treatises, it is said that this is established through the approach used in the previous arguments, and a separate argument is not provided. So we're not going to go into a second analysis of the mind, because the mind can be refuted in the same way that the I was refuted. So when I and being mind are established to be essenceless, one comprehends the emptiness, which is the diametric opposite of the entire mode of apprehension constituted by the view that is the root of cyclic existence, the view of the transitory aggregates. No more is said about that here. This is all that needs to be said, because we've been examining again Nagarjuna, and his text had already been examining emptiness and what have you. Just saying that this is highlighting that particular view, the view of the transitory aggregates. We've refuted that there's an inherently existent I, an inherently existent mind. The objects of that view are not real. And that view is what's driving the whole show, as we saw in chapter 26 when we went through it. So that finishes the first part of verse 2. Can I move on? Okay. All right, let's go forward then. We're getting into another little chapter heading in regard to how Tsongkhapa goes into his analysis of this. This is a new outline that says the method for eliminating faults by meditating on it, by meditating on this selflessness of persons. What is the method for eliminating the faults, eliminating the ignorance, and so on? So it begins by talking about the process of eliminating faults, in particular, the way to eliminate the view of the transitory aggregates, the way to eliminate the view of the transitory collection. This is covered in verse 2, the second two lines, C and D. Let's read those two. Since self and mine are pacified, one does not grasp at I and mine. Remember, it's like the example I used last week, right, of the child who is afraid of a monster being in the room, right? And if you show the child the non-existence of the monster, that there is no monster under the bed, there is no monster in the closet, there is no monster in the corner, there is no monster anywhere in the room, well then the thought adhering to that monster, that fictitious object of fear, is eliminated. The thoughts don't arise because the object of those thoughts is refuted. So since the self and mind are pacified, you've pacified that there is a real self and a real mind, an inherently existent self and mind, then you don't grasp at I and mine any longer as being that. Just like the child won't grasp at the monster as being real in that way that the conviction was there before. So Tsongkhapa says, this is still on page 375 at the bottom, depending on regular meditation on the view obtained through establishing that neither I nor being mine exist inherently, the representations, namely the self, that is the object of self grasping the person, and being mine, that is the object of the grasping of being mine, the aggregates, are pacified. That is, without perceiving any of these, subject and object are dissolved. So you can no longer have any of the adherence to those if you come to realize that they don't exist. Of course, now at a conceptual level, when we've begun our analysis of emptiness, we don't necessarily have it that strong to where we refute the object of that immediately, and the concept never arises. Instead, we have to work at it. That's why it said, depending on regular meditation on the view obtained through all of this analysis. If you are able to induce this analysis through meditation again and again and again and again and again, eventually it does become that strong through the force of your familiarity, where the concept can arise because the object it would be adhering to doesn't arise. We do this with a lot of other phenomena on the path, right? Here it's talking about emptiness, the selflessness of the person and the possessor, the mind, the sense of my. But, we do this with regard to teachings on impermanence too, right? When you first, come to the Buddhist teachings on impermanence, you are pretty much, most of us are holding to things as being pretty permanent, unchanging, and we begin to see that. And by meditating on impermanence, you come to understand the transitory nature of things, and you don't cling to them so much as being unchanging. You recognize that change happens. You recognize that this is the nature of reality. When you encounter the first noble truth, and you come to understand that what we have been calling happiness is actually dukkha, is actually unsatisfactory. If you induce that familiarization through meditation, you don't grasp it that way, right? You don't overlay that thought of this being true happiness, because it's not true happiness. It's only a relative happiness that is in its nature unsatisfactory, in its nature dukkha. So there are lots of things that we could say are familiarized in the same way. That's what meditation is. But here we're talking about then, this is the process by which that conception, that view is removed. Is because if we see the objects of that view don't exist, then the view stops arising, because there's nothing to be the object of that. There's no subject that we're observing in the midst of that exists inherently. So once the practitioner, Tsongkhapa continues in that middle of that paragraph at the bottom, once the practitioner has abandoned the view of the transitory aggregates, that the self exists essentially and being mind exists essentially, these become non-existent. So once we've abandoned the objects of that, once we've abandoned the view of that, then these become non-existent, because the correct view and that which is to be abandoned are diametrically opposed modes of apprehension of the same object, because the former is engaged with real facts. So it's like the eye that we are observing, that is the view of the transitory collection, is observing a real eye. When we undermine that real eye, the view stops. When the view stops, well then all of the overlay that is happening in regard to this process is going to stop. We aren't going to be clinging to things as existing inherently, and by virtue of that, we're not going to get caught up in all the processes of samsara and so on. So the details of the practice through mental quiescence and the cultivation of special insight, Tsongkhapa says, are explained in the great exposition of the stages of the path, and therefore are not spelled out here. So he just refers people to his Lamrim Chenmo. Says if you really want to know, how, all the detailed steps of doing the analysis and undermining this view and engaging in it fully, then by all means, go check out the Lamrim Chenmo chapters on calm abiding and special insight. So any questions on that? That's all that he had for this verse, which I think is sufficient. Just saying this is the process by which we're undermining this. If we come to see the objects of it aren't real, well, then the view itself won't arise. I mean, look at even how we've dealt with even coarser ignorance that we've had in our life, right? The first time that you saw a mirage, for example, and maybe somebody didn't even say, maybe I think my first time was we were driving in Arizona on a family vacation, and we're like in a pretty flat stretch, and we saw kind of this shimmering thing, and my dad goes, "Oh, there's a mirage," and I'm like, "What's a mirage?" And he says, "Doesn't it look like water?" And you go, "Oh yeah." He says, "It's not real. It's just a reflection." And well, of course, that can be dispelled pretty easily, right? Because you just have to drive to about the distance where you thought the water was, and you see there's no water there, right? But this is the same thing, right? The view grasping at a mirage as being real water is eliminated when we eliminate the object of that, which is real water. There's no real water there. Again, it's just a much coarser one that we all deal with at some point in our lives when we experience reflections or echoes or various phenomena that the Buddha used as examples of how things can appear to exist one way, but they lack that way of existing. Let's go on to verse 3 then. Let's read the whole verse this time. We're in the section now about kind of rebutting the argument against what we've looked at so far. So this is somebody sort of raising a bit of an argument. One who does not grasp at I and mine, that one too does not exist. For the one who does not grasp at I and mine does not perceive him or her. Again, this is someone could say, that, and even Tsongkhapa says, suppose one said that in that case, since the practitioner who has abandoned grasping I and being mine exists, the self and the aggregates must exist inherently. So this is somebody who, I don't know where they're coming from, but they're essentially saying that still the practitioner, the meditator, who is coming to realize this lack of an inherently existent I and an inherently existent mind must be real, must exist. This is like people who are real holdouts on this inherent existence, camp, trying to say, well, but something has to inherently exist. And they do run into these in a lot of the texts in the traditional studies. They keep, raising their points and being refuted because there's nothing that inherently exists. Even emptiness doesn't inherently exist. So someone may think, well, but for this to have any real impact, for it to be real in terms of the wisdom realizing that view doesn't exist because the object of that view doesn't, the object of the view doesn't exist, therefore the view is wrong. In order for that to hit home, the person has to be real. The practitioner has to be real. So Tsongkhapa says, since the self and being mind have been explained to be essenceless, nothing other than grasping I and grasping mind exists either. The practitioner who has abandoned them does not exist inherently. Whoever sees the practitioner who has abandoned, who lacks the grasping of I and mind as existing inherently, does not see the significance of the way things really are, and will not be able to abandon the view of the transitory aggregates, the grasping of I and being mine. So essentially saying that if you are still holding to the I, the person, the practitioner, to be inherently existent in the midst of refuting the I and the mine as being real that are the object of this view, you've missed the boat. You can't be realizing emptiness, selflessness as it's taught, because there'd be no ground for you to hold to the practitioner to being inherently existent. And it doesn't really make a lot of sense in my mind, because that's the whole point of the analysis, is to do it in regard to the I that is the practitioner at some level. But I guess, again, these are just various views that are being put forward. Nagarjuna doing the refutation to make sure that nobody finds anything that is inherently existent. So he quotes sutra then. Again, I don't know that I need to go into all of these, but there's a couple of sutra quotes. See the internal phenomena as empty. See the external phenomena as empty. Whoever meditates on emptiness also does not exist. And then there's a quote from the king of meditative stabilization, the Samadhi Raja Sutra, says, the person who is pacified contemplates completely pacified phenomena. That contemplator as well never has existed. And a final one, the aggregates are without essence and empty. Enlightenment is without essence and empty. He who practices is also empty of essence. This is known by those with wisdom, but not by fools. This is the Pitaputra Samagama Sutra. But this is very similar. Some of you in the room have come here when we do recitations of the Vajrakutta, maybe you're even reciting the Vajrakutta. But there's a passage in the Vajrakutta where he says, the Bhagavan said, Subhuti, it is so. If some bodhisattva were to say, I shall cause sentient beings to completely pass beyond sorrow, he should not be called bodhisattva. Why is that? Subhuti, does the dharma that is called bodhisattva exist whatsoever? Subhuti replied, Bhagavan, it does not. The Bhagavan says, Subhuti, therefore it was taught by the Tathagata that all dharmas are without a sentient being, without a living being, without a person. So just, and of course, you have to insert in there, inherent existence. We're not talking that bodhisattvas don't exist at all, or that the practitioner doesn't exist at all in this, what was put forward, or that the I or the mind don't exist at all. But their existence is so slight, so subtle. Remember, I've shared with you that Rinpoche says it's almost as if the I doesn't exist. It's almost as if the practitioner doesn't exist. It's almost as if everything doesn't exist. Because how things exist is so very slight. So again, we just reiterating this idea in this verse that kind of rebutting any argument that someone might make that seems to assert that the practitioner, in the midst of this realization of this, the view of the objects of the view of the transitory collection not existing, that somehow that practitioner could exist inherently. Then there's a final section to this little part. The way to eliminate birth by eliminating grasping is the final outline in this little part that has to do with the way of the process of eliminating the faults. Let's read verse 4 that is talking about that topic. When thoughts of I and mine are extinguished with respect to the inner and outer, the process of appropriation ceases. This having ceased, birth ceases. So again, recall that they were using this term appropriation to refer to grasping, but the idea is that once we, if we look at the undermining of that strong sense of a grasping at a self and an I, the sense of mind that comes with that, then you're going to undermine the whole process, particularly in the latter links where you have in the 8th and 9th links, the craving and grasping that get accentuated on the basis of the I that we are clinging to at that time, the I that we don't want to go out of existence, and our desire to appropriate new aggregates. That feeds the karmic seed that we planted back on the 2nd link to ripen into the 10th link, which we called becoming, which was that fully ripened seed, potentialized, ready to give birth to the next existence. And that's where the next link of birth actually comes from, is the fully ripened karma. So by virtue of undermining the strong sense of self that we're clinging to, we can eliminate that whole process. And by virtue of that, birth is eliminated. So this is what Tsongkhapa says: when the two views of the transitory aggregates, that with respect to the self, the internal, and that with respect to being mind, the external, which again would be all the things that the sense of mind that occurs with as regard to all those external things, respectively as self and mind, when all of that is eliminated, the view of the transitory aggregates is eliminated in virtue of the self and being mind not being objectified, the 4 appropriations or graspings cease, because as it is said, all the afflictions are rooted in the view of the transitory aggregates. Remember, that was what we found when we looked at the 12 links of dependent arising. The first link, the ignorance that is driving the whole show, is the view of the transitory aggregates. But of course, also it is feeding into the appropriation, the grasping that occurs in the 9th link in particular, where the ripening of that seed occurs. So he says, and all are arisen from the view of the transitory aggregates and are caused by the view of the transitory aggregates. The 4 appropriations, I don't need to go through this again because we went through chapter 26 already, but remember there were 4 types of grasping. There was grasping at views and grasping at the behavior, the wrong behavior, and the attachment, desire to the sense objects and so on. And then the view of the transitory collection itself is a form of grasping that occurs. All of that type of grasping that can happen at the end of a life is what nurtures and ripens that karmic seed that propels us into the next existence, that causes us to have birth and then consequently aging and death, and go through the whole process again. So this is, I don't need to say much more about this. This is essentially just, Nagarjuna asserting that there's an efficaciousness to this removal of this object of the view of the transitory collection. That if you remove that object, the view no longer arises. The view no longer arises. The whole process is toppled. You no longer have the first link, but you also don't feed into the craving and grasping that are the other delusions in the 12 links of dependent arising. Let's go on then to the 5th verse. This is another section then under this whole idea of the method for eliminating faults. We just looked at the process of eliminating faults. Now we go on to the way one attains liberation. And this is just verse 5. Let's read that together. Karma and afflictions having ceased, there is liberation. Karma and afflictions arise from conceptualizations. These in turn arise from elaboration, and elaboration ceases through emptiness. So they kind of are talking about kind of 3 parts to the process. What was that? Yeah. This one's great because the previous one was mostly talking about eliminating the faults that cause us to continue to take birth and so on. But here we're talking about that eventual liberation from the whole process, the whole 12 links. Everything will occur. Karma and afflictions will be completely, eliminated by virtue of their, not having a basis to stand on, to be supported by, and eventually nirvana is attained. And of course, where do karma and afflictions arise from? They arise from conceptual thought that is looking at various things and imputing qualities on them that are not there, especially if we look at kind of the karma that arises on the basis of something we find unattractive. We find it unattractive and we impute those on that, and we have mistaken conceptualizations about that make it into the whole picture of what that is and paint it all that way. Well, the underlying motivation of all of that are these elaborations these elaborations that are the elaboration of inherent existence. You know, there's lots of conceptualizations involved in all this, but the root conceptualization is called elaboration in this context. Gets a little confusing because what I'll maybe do is substitute the words that we're using when I read Tsongkhapa's commentary, because Jay Garfield, he uses conceptual thought for conceptualizations, and then he uses fabrication for elaboration. So I'll just use, I'll try to read this using the words that we've been using, and this is the Thupten Jinpa's translation that we're working with. While the process of eliminating birth is as it was explained earlier in the previous verse, right? We looked at eliminating the process of taking rebirth and samsara. It is still the case that nirvana is attained through the elimination of karma and affliction. This is because when grasping is eliminated, that which it conditions becoming does not arise, okay? So again, when that ninth link of grasping is eliminated, then becoming cannot arise. You can't nurture a seed to give birth in the next existence. When these two, however, afflictions and karma are eliminated, birth, aging, and death will be eliminated. The whole process is going to be eliminated. Everything that occurs will be eliminated, you know, everything in the 12 links. Well, then suppose one asks, by eliminating what will the afflictions and karmas be eliminated? The karma relevant to birth and psychic existence arises from afflictions. The afflictions arise from conceptualizations, improper attitude through which one takes things as pleasant and not pleasant. But these afflictions do not exist inherently. He adds that in there because, once more, there's nothing that exists inherently. This, once more, is why they can be removed. If your afflictions existed inherently, then you would always have them present and you would never be able to be free from them. But they don't exist inherently. They're there, again, adventitiously, arising from their own causes and conditions. So these conceptualizations, these improper attitudes arise from being accustomed from beginningless time to varieties of elaborations. Elaborations of the true existence of such things as knowledge and objects of knowledge, expression and meaning, the pot and cloth, man and woman, obtained and unobtained. The elaboration, that is the grasping of things as truly existent, is eliminated through familiarization with the view according to which all objects are empty. So you're going to be able to get rid of the elaboration, as it says in the last line there, through emptiness. The elaboration is the conceptualization of things as truly existent. On the basis of that, we have all these different, conceptualizations around pleasant and unpleasant and so on. We create these afflictions and they create karma, and we keep going from life to life. But if we get at the root of them, which are the elaborations of inherent existence, true existence, through coming to understand things as empty, then the whole thing has no basis. So he goes, that is the emptiness under consideration, the fact that all objects are empty. Through meditating on that view, one realizes it. When the seed of the afflictions is eliminated as the culmination of meditation, that emptiness, the termination of these elaborations, is called liberation and the attainment of nirvana. And again, it's all pretty basic stuff, but it's, the way that it's being spelled out very carefully, very meticulously, so that there's no confusion about what is going on here. When we get rid of the elaborations, which are the misconceptions of true existence, inherent existence, none of the other process arises. Because everything, again, is dependently arising. Now, I do want to share one little passage from His Holiness's commentary, because he talks about how he received, this is page 79 of this book. He says, I received the oral explanatory reading transmission of all 6 of Nagarjuna's analytic works from Serkong Rinpoche, and I received transmission of 5 of these from Kunu Rinpoche. Many of you have heard of Kunu Lama Rinpoche, really amazing practitioner. Kunu Rinpoche, who read Sanskrit well, explained to me that on the basis of the Sanskrit, this last line where it says conceptual elaboration ceases through emptiness can actually be read in more than one way. When the text translated as cease through emptiness is read in the instrumental case, then we understand it to mean that by means of realizing emptiness, conceptual elaborations come to an end. Just as, we were talking about here, right? But it can also be read in a locative sense, in which case it says that conceptual elaborations cease within emptiness. In other words, since self-grasping ignorance is a mental factor that, along with misconceiving phenomena in general, also misconceives the nature of the mind itself, which is by nature luminous and clear light, devoid of intrinsic existence, then when you realize emptiness, you gain insight into the true nature of the mind. When that happens, the grasping at the inherent existence of the mind that falsely conceives the nature of mind will come to an end. In this interpretation, it is within the mind's own emptiness that conceptual elaborations are pacified. Thus, this last line can be read in either locative or instrumental case. I thought that was kind of interesting. I'm not sure all the ramifications of it, but it is quite interesting. Yeah, Bob.
That's actually not true.
Not true?
If you look at the Sanskrit, it's in the locative case.
Uh,
That can't be instrumental. The instrumental case is a different case.
well, then we would be wrong in translating it as the way it is here.
And actually, if you look at the word, how was it translated?
Well, maybe what,
Aberration
yeah.
ceases through emptiness. Cease is an active form of the verb, should actually be passive. The
Mm.
verb is a passive verb, should be is ceased or stopped. So elaboration is
Mhm.
ceased in emptiness.
Maybe what Bob was just pointing out from his knowledge of Sanskrit, that it actually is only in the locative case and not the instrumental. So maybe what he was pointing out was that it's instrumental in the Tibetan for some reason.
Yeah, maybe.
And in the Sanskrit, it was locative. And so there's two ways that you could read it depending upon which you were translating. But
Well, actually, in some cases, they don't have the original Sanskrit. So some
Right.
people
Sure,
translate
sure.
back from the
Yeah,
Tibetan
yeah.
and try to recreate it.
But in this case, I think they do have the
So
Sanskrit.
it
Yeah,
actually
yeah.
was in one of Chandrakirti's
Mhm.
works exists in the original Sanskrit,
Mhm.
and these verses are
Mm.
given
Right.
in Chandrakirti's. So we actually do have the original Sanskrit.
But isn't even Siddharat's, isn't his translation from the Sanskrit, Mark Siddharat's, I think was his
Yeah,
name?
and that's where this translation is. I mean, he translates it.
Is that the one that you have there? I can't see what you're looking at.
Yeah, this is the
Yeah.
Siddharats and Katsura.
Okay, yeah,
He
yeah.
gives the Sanskrit. That's
Yeah.
what I can see.
And so how does he translate that last
Well,
line?
He uses, for elaboration, he uses hypostatization. But elaboration, I mean, the actual Sanskrit, which is actually usually translated as elaboration.
Uh-huh.
And so we could say, if I modify this slightly, he would translate it as elaboration is extinguished in emptiness.
So it's
Instead of
in, it's the
saying
locative, yeah.
cease, you can say it's extinguished.
Okay. So Bob was just pointing out, yeah, in the one translation from the Sanskrit that Siddharats, and I can't remember the other guy's name, Katsura, that they did, they translated as in emptiness, ceased or extinguished in emptiness.
And in the
So,
Sanskrit,
yeah, there's no variability.
There's no
Yeah.
I mean, it is.
Well, and I think it's true in the Tibetan too. So that's why it must be a misunderstanding in the way that it was His Holiness presented it, or that it was the translator, or perhaps, something else that got in there.
I don't know what
Because
happened.
it seems like the Sanskrit would be one way and the Tibetan must be the other way. But,
The Tibetans were very careful.
well,
But maybe
yeah.
they're different.
I don't know. I mean, yeah. Because, yeah, it's hard to say. I don't know enough Tibetan to speak to it. So, yeah, maybe Rachel can chime in if she wants to in terms of, I'm trying to think if I even have the Tibetan of this text. It must be somewhere. But anyway, Tony, were you going to share something?
Yeah, I guess. A little while ago, you gave Ramazopa's couple of liner on emptiness.
Uh-huh.
If I recall correctly, he said, it's almost as though it doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
My own personal investigation into emptiness, what I
Mm-hmm.
what woke me up was it's as though it almost
Yeah, I suppose that corollary would work.
Just a little bit difference in the concept. But they're essentially empty and real. And he's
Yeah.
using almost, and I'm using almost done.
So I don't want in any way, I guess the challenge with, so Tony was saying that in his experience, taking Lama Zopa's comment, that it was almost as if it doesn't exist, almost as though it doesn't exist. He says his experience is that it's almost as though it exists. But the problem then is that the implication is it doesn't exist, and it's almost as if it does exist. But Tsongkhapa would never say that the self doesn't exist at all, that there's no self at all. That's why Rinpoche's comment seems to make more sense in my mind as I understand it through the teachings. But I don't want to get into individuals' experience around it, because I think that's all personal. And that's, again, even when we get later in the text, it obviously shows that, we're talking about something that is non-conceptual in the end. There's no conceptualization of it. We're conceptualizing around it just because we need to talk about it in order to understand it. But when you get to the space of actually realizing it, the conceptualizations all fall away. And how do you describe it? How do you?
For me, just moments ago, the way
Mhm. Yeah,
described it, I just love it, you know.
yeah. Good.
It won't drop much.
Okay, good. So Tony's happy with both.
That's what I need.
Good.
Two different
All right, good.
seeming
Yeah,
in opposition.
Yeah.
And arriving at precisely the same.
Yeah. Good. Good. Was there another? Gil?
Yeah, the very first class,
Uh-huh.
you said there is no real book in my hand. In the last class, you repeated the exact same words.
Mhm.
What does the word real mean?
So Gil's asking the question if I've said previously that there's no real book in my hand, like I'm doing right now. There's no real book in my hand. Well, what we mean by real is an inherently existent book, a self-sufficient, self-existent book.
You're not answering what is real.
I said so.
You're giving me some kind of a condition about real.
No, I'm answering what it means. Real means inherently existent.
Okay, then none inherently existed. What does the word real mean? What are we talking
We're talking about something having its own reality, having its own ability to set itself up.
I see a book there in your hand that seems pretty real to me.
Right, because it appears real to you.
If I go into a bookstore and I
Yeah.
ask for a real book, they're going to bring books off the shelf.
Because you're dealing with conventionalities in that case. Because the bookstore isn't going to be a Madhyamika bookstore where you go in and they emphasize the middle way in terms of all of their books. They're going to emphasize selling books because that's what we do in conventional reality.
So why isn't that a real book? I think it's a real book. And
Because again, I was qualifying real here as meaning inherently existent. I'm not qualifying it as meaning just real in conventional terms, because that level of reality does exist, albeit again, just like we were talking about, almost as if it doesn't exist.
And what does that mean in conventional terms? Since these are the only terms we have to go by. What does that
Well, we mean that everything is merely imputed, and that's our reality.
That's the ultimate.
Well, that's the conventional reality. The ultimate reality is that nothing has any inherent existence. The conventional reality that you come to understand through realizing emptiness is that things are merely imputed, merely designated. In that way, there is no real book in my hand, because what's in my hand, if I understand it through the reasoning then, is the basis for book. The label book isn't in my hand. The basis that is labeled book is different from the label book. Book is a label that I give to the stuff that's in my hand. So there's no real book in my hand because it's merely labeled, merely designated.
is a fake book?
That's not the implication. Your logic to say that it's fake if it's not real.
That's how
It
we
doesn't-
use words.
It doesn't exist in the way that I think it exists. It doesn't have that level of reality.
It's only a book because you call it a book.
Right.
Uh-huh.
Because you've labeled it
But
society.
it's not a real book?
It's not real in Madhyamika terms, in terms of what we're looking for.
We have what we use words and we talk. And that's how
But again, this is
Somebody
an,
else could label it something else.
and the Buddha,
Different languages where they use a different
But the Buddha never denies worldly convention as being valid at some level, but only in terms of it being merely designated in the end.
The way we're talking now, the word book is meaningless.
No, it's a word that refers to a specific object that we've given a definition to.
And that makes it real.
That makes it
In one
it
sense.
real in conventional sense, as real as that. But when we talk about real in the way I was holding it up and saying there is no real book in my hand, that real that I'm using is not the same as what we're talking about here. But nonetheless, even though what I just showed you through our analysis, I can't say there's a real book in my hand because it's merely imputed as book. What I have in my hand is the basis for book. Book is a label that I give to this. And in conventional terms, yeah, you go into the bookstore and you ask for books, and this is what they'll show you, are things like look like this. But that's because that's our worldly convention, our worldly agreement, or else we couldn't even sit here and talk right now.
If you were going to a culture or society that didn't have books, didn't have a label for books, and you bring that out and you say, what is this? They're not going to say it.
Yeah, well, we're not in that situation now. We're sitting here talking to dogs.
Well,
Let's
but
take a different situation. Let's say I take a stick. I can throw it in a fire and say it's firewood. On
right.
the other hand, I can take it and use it a baseball and say it's a baseball bat.
Or you can whittle it
Is it a
and yeah.
baseball bat or is it firewood?
That's being used.
It just depends on how you label it, and how you use it.
Yeah.
It's not intrinsically one thing or another.
So those of you who are online, I apologize. We've been having a little bit of a round robin here of different comments. But I mean, it's a good question because once more, I mean, we have to look at we're equating that word real. And why I use it so much is because Lama Zopa uses it. You know, Lama Zopa says the real I. That's the way he refers to the object of refutation, the object of negation. Because that level of reality is how we and all beings who are under the sway of ignorance think about things. They think that they have their own reality. They're established from their own side. And so that does not exist. This is what we're refuting through realizing emptiness. But we're not existing utter reality, that there's no reality at all, because then there's no nirvana, there's no Buddha, there's no nothing. You know, then you fall into the nihilistic bent. You know, so what Tsongkhapa has so carefully crafted on the, you know, resting on the laurels of Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti and all these great masters, as well as the Buddha himself and the Prajnaparamita, is a wonderful system to show exactly how these two truths can exist in the world. That's why I started off with a little bit of a talk on the two truths, and we get into them in much more detail in chapter 24. The establishment of conventional truth, which starts off as being, and they are actually in the Tibetan, is called truths for an obscurer, for a concealer, because we're only knowing those through the force of our ignorance, because we hold them to be inherently existent. They appear as inherently existent, and we established all the phenomena in the world on the basis of a mind of ignorance. But then when we understand ultimate truth, we can come back and see that how conventional truths exist is really very, very slight. It's only nominal existence. Mere nominal existence, and nothing more than that. So when I use the word real, it's because Rinpoche finds it to be very evocative for how we look at things, that we are holding reality to be that way. But we never deny reality in its totality and say there is no reality at all. There is mere nominal reality. There are bases for designations, and there are the designations given to them. And then within that basis of designation, there are more things that are designated, more bases of designation, right? Because this is just designated as the dust jacket, right? There's no real dust jacket in my hand either, because this basis has no dust jacketness from its own side. And then I go to any of the parts of that, and any, you know, so on. Everything that we look at, it's like peeling an onion, and you never get to any substantial core to it. You just get another layer and another layer, and you keep removing. Yeah, Mark.
I was having trouble with this concept. And what cleared it up for me was not to think about a book or a chime ringer, but to think about a wave.
A wave.
A wave, yeah, like a wave in the ocean,
Uh-huh.
which in one sense doesn't really exist. Water doesn't move in waves. It just moves in circles. It's got weird conditions of wind and,
Mhm.
you know, wind and stuff. It's just a bizarre concept. Of course, then again, when it knocks you over or drowns you or something, then all of a sudden it's real. But you can look at it both, I mean, it's a it's an abstraction
Yeah.
to try and understand it.
So Mark, for those of you at home, was sharing that when he has a hard time analyzing some of the things in the eye and what have you, we talk about, but to use a wave at the ocean side or whatever on the water, because all the various aspects of it and what have you that cause it to appear that way, but it doesn't have any of that. But again, everything is a mere appearance, and there's that whole idea of, again, appearance and its ultimate reality, because we can use that word reality or realness in regard to ultimate. Its ultimate reality is its emptiness, its lack of existing in the way that we think it does, in the way that it appears. I don't. Did that help a little bit, Gil? Or?
It's rendering the word real meaningless. No real looking at it.
So you're saying it renders the word real meaningless, but I just gave it a meaning, so I'm not sure how. I mean, I
still use the word real. We still use the word real in terms of all other things. It does have a meaning. You can look at a picture of a pen on the table here, and I say, hand me the pen, and you hand me the picture, and I say, no, that's not a real pen.
But again, those are all. Yeah, I mean, the examples that you're using are all just conventional worldly ways of talking.
That's the only words I have.
But again, but this is why we're training in looking at things in terms of ultimate analysis. Ultimate analysis is different than conventional analysis. Conventional analysis are the keys on the table. The ultimate analysis is what is the nature of the keys. If I actually go looking for the reality of the keys in the way that they appear, I find that they don't exist that way. But most people aren't doing that. People going into bookstores and driving their cars and out at watching the waves in the ocean are not doing that. They're not looking at phenomena and analyzing their ultimate existence. Instead, they're just taking things for granted because everything appears that way. They assent to that appearance. This is the problem, is that ordinary beings are getting sucked into a trap because they think everything exists in the way that it appears. And they're not doing it. Yeah, and unless you do the analysis. Yeah. This is true too. The analysis is empty, but the analysis still needs to be done conventionally for it to have the impact. Right? See, this is the thing. It's like, this is why I love this whole concept of dependent arising being the other side of emptiness, is because dependent arising includes the whole concept of causes and conditions that, again, if you really get, we go to the third level all the time of it being merely imputed, that there's, that's the way things exist, is independence upon conceptualization and dependence upon imputation. But even the first level of dependence upon causes and conditions belies their inherent existence. You can't have things that arise from causes and conditions that are inherently existent. So again, everything does arise from all the produced phenomena, which, are development of our wisdom to that degree is a produced phenomenon. It arises from its causes and conditions. The main cause is our analysis using the wisdom that we've been presented through the teachings of Nagarjuna and Tsongkhapa and so on. Yeah, Paula.
We looked at this topic in the retreat with Geshe.
Wonderful.
And basically saying, okay, we're labeling a book, but we're not looking at the dependent arising in the sense of, okay, the seed grew the tree with the water and the sun and all this, and then it went into pulp, and then it went into ink and all this. So it's not just book,
Right.
labeling it as book, but we're not looking at all the factors that went into producing it. So, it's not solid like that.
Right. So Paula was pointing out, the experiences from Geshe Cherub's retreat on emptiness earlier this year, and the whole interdependence of all the other factors that contribute to it, which we're blind to. We think it has this unitary bookness that is independently existing apart from all of that. But, it can't have any independent existence because everything is dependently arising.
Right.
So, yeah, Nancy. Okay. This will have to be fairly quick. It is 8:15 now, but let's hear the question. And
When you talk about regular meditation on selflessness, do you mean analytical meditation or stabilizing meditation?
the phrase was used here of regular meditation, the process of, let me see where I read that earlier. But anyway, the question is whether I mean analytical meditation or stabilizing meditation. Well, you kind of have to have both. I mean, in the end, the culmination of our meditation is to have what's called a union of calm abiding and special insight. Calm abiding is what we arrive at on the basis of stabilizing meditation, through going through the 9 mental abidings and eventually getting to that stage where we have this very calm mind that can remain undistracted for as long as we wish. We can meditate on any object, particularly emptiness, and not be moved from that, and have this sort of flexibility of mind and body in doing that. The culmination of our analytical meditation, particularly on emptiness, is what's called special insight. And special insight is when we have gained the penetrative insight into emptiness through repeatedly meditating on it again and again. So you never really you cannot have a fully qualified special insight without having a fully qualified calm abiding, because special insight depends upon calm abiding. And so in that way, you would say the first step is to have the calm abiding, and then you can introduce the special insight, because without calm abiding, you can't have special insight. But nonetheless, I mean, for us now at the stage where we don't have either of those, at least I don't, then we're just talking about our going back and forth between these two, stabilizing the mind quite well in terms of using the breath or a Buddha image or something as an object of meditation to stabilize, and then introducing analytical meditation, going through the 4-point analysis, for example, and coming to the conclusion of emptiness, that there is no inherently existent I that exists, the same as the aggregates, different from the aggregates, therefore it doesn't exist. And then when you get to that point, you go back to stabilizing using that conclusion, trying to bring it deeper into the mind. And then you go back to the analytical when it wanes and get the point again. And then you go back to the stabilizing. You just keep going back and forth between those. So I can't say that it's just one or the other. It's usually both in tandem, doing some level of stabilizing meditation as a precursor and as a necessary step as you're going through the analysis. And eventually, once more, you have to have them united. They sound like they're in opposition, because the analytical and special insight is all about thinking about things, and the calm abiding is all about removing thought, it seems. But nonetheless, you have to kind of calm the thought and bring the mind to that single point of focus, and then introduce thought in the midst of that. Your analysis happens within the calm abiding mind. So I don't know if that, hopefully that answered.
It seems to me there's a path of calm abiding concentration, which leads directly to selflessness, which is that I think of it like a camera. A camera cannot ever take a picture of itself.
Right.
So the essence of meditating on an object means that you can either see the object or you can see yourself, but you can't, the self can sort of doesn't, that setup of the self seeing the object actually can't exist, because there's no self, because you can't see yourself, because no perception can be aware of itself. Does that make sense?
I'm not sure it does, Mark, but I'm not going to be able to rephrase your question for the folks at home. But
if your eye's a camera, the eye can never see the eye.
But I think the mind is not like a camera. When we're talking about the mind realizing emptiness, the mind can know all phenomena, including the mind itself. I mean, there's nothing in the way of the mind knowing itself, because mind is the mere experience. So we are knowing that. But my problem with what you were talking, the way that your words started going, was that you seem to be conflating inherently existent self with self once more. There still is a self. There still is a mind. All these phenomena still exist. They just don't exist in the way that we think they do. In that real way, to use the word that gets sticky. Because again, they don't exist in reality in the way that ignorance is grasping at them to. But they still have some level of reality.
If the mind is that which perceives,
right?
That which is aware, then it's impossible for the mind to be aware of itself. It can't happen.
I think by every moment of experience, we can have that awareness of what's going on in our own minds. I mean, oftentimes, you know, the meditation is in Mahamudra and some of these other techniques is to use the mind as the basis for realizing emptiness, that you observe mind observing mind. I don't think the mind is like a camera that, you know, you said a camera can't take a picture of itself,
If
but
it's the center of awareness, then if that which is aware can't see that which is aware, it can't happen because it's like
So why don't you hold on to, because we really do need to wrap things up today, but hold on to this because we've got a few weeks to hold on to it. but maybe kind of meditate on it and also just again really get at you, because you're seeming to again say that this is an impossibility for mind to know mind. But I think I would disagree with that I think mind can know mind, and that it's just the mere experience that we're having. You know, there's a huge debate in the traditional teachings about whether there's some other aspect of mind that is self-cognition.
But only in the sense of nirvana or emptiness.
Anyway, yeah, but let's revisit this. But
the mind isn't just a single thing.
yeah,
Mind has all of these different parts.
yeah. So this is something for to chew on. I'll see what I can find to kind of. No, whoops, clock just went off. That's okay, that can stay on the ground. It just was knocked off when I was putting these papers back. So yeah, we got lots to think about. So again, over the next few weeks, I would really encourage you to at least do this 4-point analysis. Again, we've gone through the steps, and so you can kind of look at some of these consequences if you have some of these books, but just try to, you know, really spend some time in analysis on this. And then, you know, see what questions come up. But this one is a good one too, you know, to explore what is the nature of mind and what can mind observe. And yeah, we'll talk about it more. So January, what day is our next? 9th? No, 8th. The 8th will be our next meeting. Let's go to page 235 and conclude tonight with the dedication prayers, the first 2 as usual. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish but increase more and more. Page 245, there's the prayer that's paperclip there for His Holiness' long life. We'll do that one, and then the one on the previous page for Rinpoche. As we recite these, think that we're creating the causes for all spiritual guides of whatever tradition to have good health and long lives, to continue to help beings in this world, and for us and others to always have perfect guides in all our lifetimes. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the 3 jewels. Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. And again, dedicate for anyone else you're holding in your heart so they may benefit from what we've done here tonight. And may all be our efforts here this evening. Okay, thank you all, especially all those who asked questions and shared in the dialogue. Maybe we are actually going to do this going forward with Geshe Sherab's classes when he returns, is actually incorporate some discussion into every evening. So you'll get a chance to kind of cogitate over this with each other and kind of do your own little mini debate, civil debate. nothing too strong, but yes, Gil. Yes, you would. You get an A for civility. So, all right. So thank you all, and have very good holiday season. I hope to see most of you on Saturday. We should really, have a nice crowd here for Lama Tsongkhapa Day. This is celebrating 600 years since his passing in 1419. So it's a very auspicious day in that regard, as well as being one of these powerful days. And we're benefiting from Tsongkhapa in so many ways, all of his legacy. So it's good to do that practice in particular to make that strong connection, keep it very solid. So, all right, good. Thank you.